Growing up in Arizona, I was steeped in the land's myths and legends. Native traditions, strange vortexes, UFO sightings, and countless stories of the unknown surrounded me. They fascinated me from an early age. I spent much of my time wandering the desert and mountains, hunting, camping, exploring the vast wilderness. It became my second home, and I felt as though I truly belonged there, deep in the heart of the Arizona wild. One late spring day, I ventured out on one of my many trips. I had a habit of straying off the beaten path, and after hours of aimlessly wandering, I stumbled upon a small cluster of old mud adobe houses. The air was still, the sun hanging low in the sky, and as I approached, a few figures emerged from the doorways, eyeing me curiously. After a brief exchange between them, they seemed to agree that I wasn't a threat. One of the elders, an older man dressed in traditional Navajo clothing and a headdress, approached me slowly. His gaze was steady yet kind, as he asked if I was lost or in need of assistance. "I'm not lost," I told him, "but I am intentionally wandering." He chuckled softly, his deep voice a sound of ancient wisdom, and invited me to join him for a meal with his family. What followed was one of the most surreal and memorable experiences of my life. The time spent with him felt like stepping back in time. We shared stories around the fire, swapping tales of family, history, and life in the wild. As the evening unfolded, more members from the surrounding houses joined us, and I quickly sensed that they didn't often have outside visitors. Their hospitality was generous, and the longer we spoke, the more their stories took an eerie quality, full of ancient secrets. However, there was one man who didn't speak a word. He just sat quietly, watching me with an intensity that unsettled me. During our conversation, I mentioned my annual walkabouts, long solo hikes into the wilderness that I took every September. The silence of the elderly man suddenly broke. He stood and walked over to me, sitting at the circle's edge, and asked me to join him on the ground. He spoke slowly, almost reverently, recounting his own walkabouts from years past. He described a canyon he once ventured to, a place he called dangerous but magical, telling me that I would see the world differently if I returned. The weight of his words hung in the air, and I knew deep down that I would return to this place. Later, he invited me to his home, a small weathered structure. The door to the back room stood slightly ajar, and inside, I glimpsed animal pelts, mostly coyotes and wolves, draped across the walls. Without saying a word, the man closed the door, picked up an old map, and handed it to me, along with handwritten directions that seemed worn from years of use. He walked silently away, vanishing into the back room. That night, one of the families invited me to stay. I accepted it gratefully. The next morning, as I was preparing to leave, an old woman approached me. In her hands, she held something small, an object wrapped in cloth. She handed it to me with the quiet command, "Dip your bullets in the white ash at the hottest part of the fire." Then, without a word, she turned away. As the months passed, curiosity gnawed at me. But September came, and I packed up for my walkabout. As I was preparing, I found the talisman the woman had given me in the drawer. Something inside me told me to take it, so I packed it carefully into my gear and set off on the journey. The drive was long, the road marked on the old map overgrown and hard to find. By the time I reached the Forest Service Road, it was much later than I had anticipated, so I decided to camp and start my hike in the morning. The next day, after several hours of hiking on a forgotten trail, I came upon a narrow crack in the cliffs. There was a stream running through it. The water only waist deep, but too narrow for a kayak or a canoe. I hoisted my gear over my head and waded through, the cold water creeping up to my chest as I moved forward. The crack in the cliff stretched endlessly, and after what felt like hours, the canyon opened up into a hidden valley. A small lake sat in the middle, surrounded by tall rock faces. The place so remote it seemed no human had ever stepped foot there. No sign of civilization, no trash, no evidence of campfires. Just pure, untouched wilderness. That night, the valley was eerily quiet. No birds, no frogs, no wind, nothing. The silence pressed against me like a weight. The next morning, I set out to explore the valley. Despite my previous experience with mountain lions, I felt at ease, even though I always keep my gun at my side when hiking. Hours pressed as I trekked, and eventually, I found a narrow path leading up the side of a cliff. It led to caves that seemed to invite me in. I entered one cautiously, calling out to make my presence known. The cave was vast, a single chamber that stretched back a couple 100 feet. My headlamp cut through the darkness, revealing no tracks except my own. But then, at the back of the cave, my light fell upon something that made my heart stop. A pile of bones. A mixture of animal and human, stacked carelessly together. Amid the bones was a small, ancient candle sitting on a natural stone shelf. It was old, the wax hardened and blackened. But it wasn't the candle that chilled me to my core. It was the realization that these bones were not from some distant past. They were recent. A cold dread swept over me and I quickly turned to leave. As I exited the cave, my heart raced. The light of day offered little comfort. Standing just 75 feet away from me was the largest wolf I had ever seen. It was perched on a rock, watching me intently. Then it dropped to all fours, and without a sound, it just stared. I fired 2 shots into the air, hoping to scare it off, but it didn't flinch. Didn't even move. Wolves are known to flinch at the sound of gunshots, but this one didn't. After a moment, I turned, grabbed my binoculars, and looked back. But the wolf was gone. Vanished. I returned to camp with a heightened sense of unease. Night fell quickly in the canyon, and with that came the silence once more. As the sun disappeared, I saw a flicker of light coming from the area of the cave. Though it didn't make sense. It couldn't have been that candle. It had burned out long ago. I decided to investigate the next day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. At dawn, a strange haze lingered over the canyon floor, but it quickly dissipated with the rising sun. I gathered my things and headed back towards the cave. As I climbed higher, I stumbled upon another cave entrance, smaller than the first. A twisted juniper stood at the mouth, its branches adorned with strange objects, bones, old artifacts, and what looked like Native American relics. Something about it felt wrong, but curiosity pushed me forward, and I entered the cave. The walls were covered in ceremonial paintings, their vivid colors clashing with the dark shadows. The deeper I went, the colder it became. By the time I reached the back of the cave, I found an altar made of wood and bones. But the most disturbing sight was a small, pale figure sitting on the ledge high above me. Her face painted white, a crown of branches adorned with 2 small antlers. I stared at her for a few moments, convinced she was a long dead relic. But then I heard a faint voice, an ancient, unintelligible language. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. Panic seized me. I bolted from the cave, my headlamp flickering as I felt someone close behind me. The flicker of the light from the entrance pushed me forward, and as I neared the cave's mouth, I caught sight of the wolf again. This time it stood upright, looming over me, its gaze unblinking. Back to camp, packed my things up as quickly as I could, and set up a fire larger than usual, hoping the flames would keep whatever was out there at bay. That night, the wolf returned, walking towards me with a slow, deliberate gait. I fired, the shots hitting its body, but it didn't even notice. I emptied my magazine. My gun clicked empty, but the creature didn't stop. My hand shook as I fumbled for my backup ammo. As I reached into my bag, the talisman the woman had given me slipped from my pack. I clutched it, remembering her words. Dip your bullets in the white ash. I grabbed an arrow, dipped it into the ash from my fire, and shot. The arrow struck the wolf, and he let out a terrible scream, a sound like nothing I had ever heard. The creature spun and ran back into the trees. When he did, I saw the woman with the antler crown standing by the tree line, waiting for him. They both disappeared into the shadows, and for the rest of the night, I could hear the faint, otherworldly voice echoing from the depths of the canyon. Didn't sleep a wink. At dawn, I packed up and left the valley, knowing I would never return. The next spring, I returned to the Navajo reservation, wearing the talisman around my neck. The first person to greet me was the woman who had given it to me. She embraced me tightly and whispered, "You heard me." When I asked about the old man who had given me the map, they told me he vanished shortly after my visit, never to be seen again. I tried to tell them what had happened, but no one would let me. An old man in the corner muttered a word under his breath, one I had never heard before, untouched. I later found out that meant skinwalker in Navajo. I did try to tell them my story, but they wouldn't let me. They only nodded knowingly and refused to speak of it again. I visited the reservation a few more times over the years, but I never went back to the canyon. Curiosity still gnaws at me, but deep down, I know I can never go back to that place, to that hidden valley, where the line between the natural world and something far darker blurred beyond recognition.